Welcome, everyone. On behalf of the Southern Alliance for Clean Energy, I'd like to thank you for joining today's webinar about the Southeast regional findings of the new National Climate Assessment. My name is Chris Carnevale, and I'm the Coastal Climate and Energy Manager for the Southern Alliance for Clean Energy. Next slide. For those of you not familiar with Southern Alliance for Clean Energy, we're a regional membership organization that promotes responsible energy choices to ensure clean, safe, and healthy communities throughout the Southeast. We'd like to acknowledge our members on this call and encourage those of you who are not members to please join us today. For ways in which you can become a member and get involved, please visit our website, cleanenergy.org. Now, I'd like to take a moment to review the basic functions of the Zoom platform on the bottom of your screen. To ensure sound quality, all attendee lines will be muted throughout this presentation. If you're having trouble hearing or seeing the slides, click the chat button and type in your problem so that we can help you troubleshoot. We also have saved time at the end of this presentation to answer questions. So to ask a question, click the Q&A button along the bottom of your screen, and we'll work to get to as many questions as we can at the end. Lastly, we are recording this webinar, and we'll send you the recording once it is uploaded online. Next slide, please. This webinar is part of the Southeast Coastal Climate Network webinar series. The Southeast Coastal Climate Network is a network of individuals and organizations interested in climate and energy in the Southeast. If you enjoyed today's webinar and would like to receive regular news updates and action alerts, please join the network by emailing me at chris@cleanenergy.org. Next slide, please. Joining us today are two authors of the Southeast Region chapter of the National Climate Assessment, Dr. Kirstin Dow and Doug Marcy. Dr. Kirstin Dow is Carolina Trustees Professor of Geography at the University of South Carolina. She's a social environmental geographer focusing on understanding climate impacts, vulnerability, and adaptation using methods involving extensive participation of stakeholders and decision makers. Dow serves as principal investigator of the Carolinas Integrated Sciences and Assessments, also known as CISA, which is one of 11 NOAA-supported regional integrated sciences and assessments teams partnering with decision makers to bridge climate science and decision-making in support of climate adaptation strategies specific to water, coasts, and public health in the Carolinas. Then we'll hear from Doug. Doug Marcy is a coastal hazard specialist at the NOAA Office for Coastal Management in Charleston, South Carolina. He has been with NOAA for 16 years, working on flooding and sea level rise geospatial mapping projects, storm surge assessments, and coastal hazards assessment projects, contributing to more disaster-resilient communities. Prior to working at NOAA, Doug worked as a hydraulic engineer with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers Charleston District from 1999 to 2002, and with the South Carolina Office of Ocean and Coastal Resource Management from 1997 to 1999. Doug has a MS in Marine Geology from the University of North Carolina at Wilmington, and a BS in Geology from the College of Charleston. So with that, I'll turn it over to Kirstin. Kirstin, you're on mute right now. You can unmute yourself, or Kyle can unmute you maybe.
Sorry, I'm unmuted.
Thanks.
All right. So thanks everyone for joining us. I'm happy to be here and talk with you about the chapter. It was a large group effort, and Doug and I are representing a big team, and we'll answer as many of your questions as we can, and certainly be happy to connect you with other experts if the questions are outside our areas. But for right now, I'm going to talk about the first and the last messages, which are the ones I was most closely involved in. And then we'll have Doug pick up on the others. So if we can go to the next slide. So this is a lot of text, but there are a couple key things in here that I'd like you to be aware of, is that many of the Southeast cities are particularly vulnerable because of expected impacts to infrastructure in urban areas and to health, because the cities themselves are in their infrastructure capable of trapping a good deal of additional heat and exacerbating the heat risks that are already apparent in the region. In addition, the concentrated populations there mean that the potential for disease spread and for large-scale impacts associated with flooding are major concerns. But while those are concerns, there's also opportunities, because while we're in the fastest, many of the Southeast cities are among the fastest growing in the country, that growth is an opportunity to do more effective design and improve our urban design and reduce greenhouse gas emissions to prevent these further negative impacts of climate change. Go to the next slide. This slide has got a lot of detail on it, but what I'd like you to see is that the number of hot days above 95 degrees hasn't necessarily been the biggest signal. The really important signal for human health has been that the number of nights above 95 degrees Fahrenheit, those nighttime hours that we depend to cool our houses if we don't have a lot of air conditioning, and to cool the out of doors if we're going to plan our work to start early in the morning, have increased substantially, particularly between 1960 and in the 1910s. Some of these changes are in the 80 to 100% range, and as you can see, it's a very widespread, consistent signal across the Southeast. Now, we are going to expect more extremes in temperature variability due to changes in the jet stream over time, and we'll also see, in association with this, more intense storms, because there'll be larger differences in the cold and warm air masses that create those storms as they come together. The clash becomes bigger as the differences become greater. Next slide. We've also seen that there's further evidence that climate change is already occurring in looking at the historical change in the length of the freeze-free season. Now, this season has grown by about 10 or 12 days since the 1980s, consistently across the Southeast. And this is important because it has implications for agriculture. Many of our key crops, blueberries, peaches, and others, need a certain period of chilling days that they may not get. And it also signals that it's also important for the potential of pests to find new habitat, where the freeze often knocks back some insects and things that you'd rather not have moving further north. With the decrease in the freeze-free days, the opportunities for those organisms to move further northward increase. Next slide. This slide shows the historic variability in heavy precipitation. It shows that the record of that increased precipitation is quite variable across the Southeast, with a majority of stations seeing greater days of heavy precipitation since the 1980s. The more general pattern of precipitation across the Southeast has been that the falls are become wetter and the springs and summers are becoming drier generally by about 5 to 15%. Generally, we're seeing those wetter conditions primarily in the east. And as you go further west to Louisiana, Missouri, Mississippi, and the western parts of Kentucky and Tennessee, there's been a slight drying trend overall. Next slide. This again gets to that question about the number of warm nights. This is the historical record, averaging from, if you look at the average from 1976 to 2005, for those of you who've been in the region for a while, many of these temperatures are down at the lower end of the scale, except until you get down to Florida, Louisiana. But next slide. If we look at the projected number of warm nights, and here we see the human health implications, on the upper left image, we have the mid-century scenario for the higher greenhouse gas emission scenario, and on the lower left, we have the lower scenario. And then on the right, we have the late 21st century scenarios for both higher and lower. And the reason I'm taking a moment to pull that out is to look at this slide, I think, emphasizes the choice we have ahead of us, that right now we've heard a number of different calls to reduce greenhouse gas emissions to avoid the worst impacts of climate change. For us here in the Southeast, these warm nighttime temperatures are consistent with other findings about increased heat and really illustrate what's at stake. I'll talk more about what that means for projected labor losses, for occupational health later on. But for here, I'd like you to just look at the range of colors and the number of nights. That scale is compressed at the end from 0 to 5, 5 to 10, and then you see these much larger areas of the darker reds under that higher emission scenario, which is the one that global emissions are tracking at the moment. Next slide. Under these changing conditions, we expect that the habitat suitability for Aedes aegypti mosquito to extend. And you can see here the reds indicate where the potential abundance is already high. The moderate to high abundance then spreads further through the Southeast. Now this mosquito is capable of carrying dengue fever, chikungunya, which is also called breakbone disease, and Zika, which of course we've all heard a lot about. So this expanding, and it's capable of living in almost any conditions where the temperatures are suitable. It needs very little water for a habitat. So it could be a big challenge for the Southeast, and it's a great source of concern. Next slide. Those are what I wanted to share with you in terms of the historical and projected climate changes. Doug will talk to you more about key message number 2.
Thank you, Kirstin. Hope everybody can hear me. And I'd like to echo Kirstin's sentiment that I'm happy to be on today with you discussing these 4 key messages. I'm going to talk to you about number 2 and number 3. Number 2 here is, again, these are pretty large key messages. They're long. But one of the intents of this particular climate assessment versus NCA 3 was to focus in on the risk, what is at risk in our different regions. So in the first part of these key messages, we show that in this case, in the coastal plain and in low-lying regions, the areas where, as Kirstin mentioned, we have a rapid population growth. A lot of it is based on a tourism-based economy, folks going to the beach and whatnot. Critical industries are building, car industries especially are focusing, and we've actually had more manufacturing going on in the Southeast. But these areas are also highly vulnerable to the climate change impacts. So key message number 2 is really about extreme rainfall events and sea level rise combining together to increase flood frequencies, which is starting to impact infrastructure, property values, especially in our coastal cities, and focus in a little bit on some of the adaptation measures that have been going on in the cities to try to reduce this risk in the future. Next slide, please. So just a little bit before I go into this graphic, the average global sea level has gone up about globally 8 to 9 inches since 1880, but locally, within the Southeast, we've seen rates in the last 100 years of 1 to 3 feet, all the way from 3 feet in the last 100 years in Louisiana to as much as 1 foot of rise in the Southeast areas like Charleston and Savannah. And that has caused us to have more frequent coastal flooding events, not just from storms, but actually from high tide flooding. We have tides called king tides, or the scientific term is perigean tides. But these are the highest tides of the year, and they're starting to impact the coastal regions much more frequently. As a matter of fact, looking at in 2015, we had a all-time record number of flooding occurrences in places like Charleston. We had 38 days of flooding, Miami, 18 days, Mayport, Florida, 19 days, and again in 2016, we've seen some all-time records. So, and this is also, so what you see in this graphic is an example from Savannah, Georgia, the Fort Pulaski tide gauge there, showing you the number of observations of high tide flooding events we've seen. And this is based on going over a certain amount of water levels based on National Weather Service definitions of what is a kind of a minor flood. And you can see we've had an increase going up to the present and the observations, and then with the different climate scenarios, as Kirstin mentioned, the greenhouse gas scenarios, you can see that in the future we're going to have a much greater number of these, even if at the lower scenarios going out to the rest of the century. Next slide, please. Also, this increase in the high tide flood frequency is really also has led to like an increase, a fourfold increase in the probability of exceeding the thresholds. This is a great graphic from Norfolk area, the Norfolk tide gauge there at Sewell's Point, showing you the distribution of the number of flood events we've had from the 1960s to the 2000s, where this entire distribution has moved to the right. You can see the line there where flooding begins. You can see now that we have many more flood events occurring, so it's changing the distribution of these events, and that in turn will affect even extreme water level events, where we'll see more extreme events occurring because that entire shift due to sea level rise. Next slide. And in the future, we can expect more sea level globally, but also locally, we're going to experience that upwards of the extreme range up to maybe 8 feet. More likely scenarios of around 3 to 4 feet by 2100. And communities are starting to actually do things to try to adapt to this increased flooding. This is a great case study if you go into the chapter looking at what Charleston, South Carolina has done. It's starting to become a big problem managing stormwater in places not just on the coast, but increase in precipitation. Extreme precipitation is overwhelming stormwater systems. They weren't designed to handle more than maybe a 25-year storm event. We're starting to see many more extreme events, and when they're coupled with coastal flooding, we have issues. So Charleston actually has invested quite a bit of money. If you look at the case study, they've invested a lot of money into building a 140-foot tunnel that actually will drain water out of the city and pump it into the Ashley River. They've probably spent $235 million to date ongoing drainage improvement projects and looking at elevating the lower battery seawall to try to protect from sea level rise. So many communities are starting to actually invest real money into trying to improve the drainage and reduce the flooding impacts, especially some coastal areas. For instance, Tybee Island, Georgia is also doing, looking at the causeway that connects Tybee with the rest of the Savannah area that gets inundated even during high tides. It just got inundated this last over Thanksgiving weekend with a king tide we had. So they're looking at things like raising the roads. Miami Beach has also done a lot of work on that, spending over $500 million raising roads and trying to improve the infrastructure. Next slide. And looking into the future, a lot of communities, and this is just another case study where Charleston, again, is looking at out 50 years, trying to figure out, what do we plan to? We have all these different scenarios, high and low. But what they've decided to do was look out to about 2065, and they just revised this, actually. It was 1.5 to 2.5 feet based on critical infrastructure, 2.5 feet. But now they're going to be revising that to 2 and 3 feet. So trying to plan for additional 2 to 3 foot of like freeboard for structures and for drainage projects in their future planning when we do future construction. So as Kirstin mentioned, with all the development going on, especially in a lot of the coastal cities, there is an opportunity there to start taking sea level rise into account and maybe build more robust infrastructure to be able to handle the future events we're likely to see. Okay, next slide. And this is affecting not just places like on the southeast and on the Atlantic side, but also on the Gulf side. There's a really good case study here. It was actually mentioned in the NCA 3, the third National Climate Assessment, where this community, which is Isle de Jean Charles, which is a tribe, an actual, it's the Biloxi Jamaica, I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right, tribe, and they have been displaced. It's a narrow island in the South Terrebonne Parish in Louisiana, and they've experienced about 98% of their landmass lost. So they've experienced kind of a breakup of their community and people moving to other places. And they've actually applied and got a lot of funding, upwards of $48 million, to actually implement their resettlement plan. This is just a graphic showing their tribe leader, their executive secretary, having a community meeting where they're planning to resettle the entire community out of this area that's going to be impacted by the future land loss. So there's real good examples of the adaptation process beginning in a lot of the Southeast communities. Next, please. In addition to the sea level rise problem, we've also seen in the inland areas just a large amount of extreme rainfall events since the last climate assessment. Our job in the NCA4 was to sort of do an update. And so we only went back since 2014 when the last climate assessment, and we've had major damages. These are billion-dollar disasters in the Southeast and casualties from flooding events, including, a lot of folks know, the 2015 event we had in South Carolina. We've had Hurricane Matthew. Louisiana had a major flooding event near Baton Rouge in 2016. And we stopped there, but we've had a lot of issues since then. We've had Irma. We've had Florence this last year in North Carolina, record flooding, Michael in Georgia. So this continues to go on. And so we'll be capturing these events again in the next climate assessment. So it doesn't look like the trend is changing. If you go to the next slide. This is just an example of the 2015 extreme rainfall event. This is a case study. And you can see the amount of water that fell here in South and North Carolina, up to 24 inches. Again, this was like a 1,000-year rain event. Hadn't seen this type of extreme rainfall here in South Carolina in a very long time. Seems like these extreme rainfall events are just increasing, and the evidence does show that. If you go to the next slide, this is just showing a photograph of what happens. Many roads were impassable. Obviously, it causes major damage. But the story here was also that we had a very high tide or king tide event going on at the same time we had this rain. So it's a combination of the sea level rise and high tide events with the extreme rainfall. We didn't design our stormwater systems to handle both things happening at the same time. So things like putting in backflow preventers and starting to account for the tides when we do stormwater infrastructure is going to be critical. And also starting to design for higher rainfall amounts when we do stormwater design is going to be crucial to try to reduce the amount of loss we've seen recently. Okay, next slide. Embedded in this chapter, we did address the Hurricane Irma, because that did sort of happen right as we were finishing up this. And so that is in here, and it really just talks about that the warm water we've seen with the increase in, and obviously we've seen this not just from Irma, but we've had many extreme hurricanes over the past few years. We think that's due to two factors, and that's what led to the formation and the strength of Irma, which was the warm waters to a greater depth over the hurricane formation areas and areas where they pass through on their way to potentially hit the U.S. Lighter winds in the upper atmosphere as well led to that. So these high intensity hurricanes are expected to be not necessarily more frequent, but definitely going to be expected to be more intense due to the increasing ocean temperature. Next slide. Okay. Number three, key message number 3 deals more with the natural ecosystems and how they're going to be transformed by all of some of the climate impacts. Again, this points out the risk part first, which is that we have a diverse amount of natural systems in the Southeast. We've got a lot of changing patterns in terms of temperatures, wildfire, sea levels that are starting to impact species, migration. And as a result, what things that we depend on for our livelihood, for instance, are starting to become at risk. So future generations are going to have to start to deal with this and start to interact with the natural systems in a different way than we have. Next slide. So the first thing to show is that just our normal growth periods of areas of what they call plant hardiness zones. So some of our zones which we're used to planting at certain times of the year, and certain species can grow in certain areas due to the temperature range. That's starting to change. You can see this figure historically from 1976 to 2005 versus a higher scenario greenhouse gas. You see there's hardly any blue in the figure on the right. That's going to drastically impact what can grow in certain parts of the Southeast because of the temperature change. Next slide. In addition, you're going to start to see species migration. For instance, areas that are now salt marsh in a lot of the Southeast potentially will start to convert to mangrove forests as we have a higher heat content, not only in the ocean, but also temperature-wise. We will start to see potentially a migration of some of these tropical species farther north. So because the salt marshes are very productive for certain types of larval fish, that's going to impact that. And different species tend to live in these different vegetative environments. So as they change, that's going to change the species as well. Next slide. Just an example showing that we'll start to see, areas where we rely on these open marshes and grasslands will potentially convert to more of the mangrove species, and I guess that is left to be decided whether that's a good or bad thing. Sometimes the mangroves can cause protection from waves, from storm surges and waves from hurricanes, whereas the grasses don't as much, but it will definitely change the ecosystems. Next slide. In addition, we're going to start to see potentially more invasive species. This is a really sort of the textbook example of all of the Burmese pythons that are, they're not necessarily, they're not native. They were introduced to the Florida Everglades by mostly there were people's pets that got out. And now because of the warmer temperatures, they are able to survive and flourish and become a real nuisance in some places. So it's the unintended consequences of introducing species, but because the climate is changing, more invasive species may be able to flourish and impact other more native species. Next slide. And then another thing that's going to be affected is we spent a lot of time, actually one of our authors, Kevin, worked on this, and that is that the wildfires. It's funny, in the Southeast we don't typically think of ourselves as a huge wildfire spot. In other words, we see on the news that the West Coast is impacted. They've had huge amounts, and certainly the West Coast, the amount of acreage is affected by wildfires is much larger. But in actuality, in the Southeast, we have the more number of fires than anywhere else in the country. But a lot of those are prescribed burns by usually the Forest Service or other entities that are actually trying to reduce the amount of fuel by doing prescribed burns to reduce the potential for wildfire. And you can see this graphic that over the years, the number of wildfires has actually gone down, but the number of prescribed burns has gone up. So managing wildfires has been pretty successful. The worry is that with climate change, next slide please, that we're going to, back up one. I thought we had one more. With the prescribed burns, we're going to, increase of the population and the urban development is potentially going to not enable us to do as many prescribed burns, and also with drought and things and changing in some of the vegetation types, we may not be able to do the prescribed burning may not be as effective. And that's the thinking that right now we have a pretty successful history of doing this, but in the future that may not be the case. And just a couple more things, and I'll kick it back to Kirstin. One of the things that this section number 3 also does address is that we also see with sea level increasing that we have more saltwater intrusion, which is going to impact our drinking water, but that's also going to cause a change in the marsh species. So the marsh will tend to want to migrate with sea level rise, but if the marsh is not able to, if it's blocked by like a levee or urban development, then these marshes actually might drown. Again, that's a big area where the nursery for a lot of our larval fish, and will start to impact fish. And things like ocean warming in itself will cause issues with fisheries as well, with species migration, species going farther north. Coral reefs have been impacted because of bleaching due to ocean temperatures increasing, as well as sea turtles also being impacted. So it stretches much beyond just the terrestrial region. That's going to also affect a lot of our commercial fishing as well. And I think with that, there's a lot more on that chapter in these two, but I will kick it back to Kirstin for number 4. Next slide.
There is a lot in the chapter, and we're trying to go through it and leave time for questions and answers. So I'll introduce you to section 4 of the chapter. Here, the focus was on the rural heritage of the South and looking at our agriculture and forest industries in the less populated areas. But the rural South isn't entirely agriculture and forest. There's a great diversity of activity taking place in these areas. So manufacturing discussions were also included here. And importantly, as we think about these really heat-exposed occupations, it's potential that by the end of the century, under the high scenario, 1/2 billion labor hours could be lost from extreme heat-related impacts of simply people working with more breaks and avoiding the heat stroke associated with being out in the extreme temperatures for long periods of time. This is expected to be a negative impact on the agricultural industry. And I'll talk a little bit more about how this increased stress will compound some additional stresses in rural areas due to limits to the local community capabilities, the demography, poverty incidence, earnings, and the capacity of rural communities to address some of them. Again, the good news is that there are many ways to reduce these stresses and increase resilience, and I have some examples of those as well. Next slide. So at this point in section number 4, you'll see some of the themes are starting to overlap. This image is a close-up of a ramp. It's a wild onion that the Cherokee have been harvesting for centuries as part of a cultural tradition, and it's part of sustenance because this emerges in the spring, and it's there providing nutrients through the long winter when there's a dearth of fresh vegetables. But it's also a family tradition of harvesting techniques and making part of and a tradition that's really part of deeply held tribal lifeways. Now, these ramps are already at the edge of their southern range, so that plant hardiness question that we saw Doug raise, along with the decreased moisture, is going to increase existing stresses on those plants and other agricultural practices. I mentioned it, this is a specific example of how it'll impact indigenous people, but agriculture in the South is also an enormous concern, and there'll need to be adjustments there too in thinking about what to do about irrigation in areas where we have large concentrated animal feeding operations and so on. Temperature control may become an issue in simply the design of the facilities where animals are kept. So it's going to go from the peaches and blueberries I mentioned before that need the stress to indigenous crops to large-scale commercial agriculture. The next slide. This this slide summarizes the change in projected hours that I mentioned earlier. So we see that over half billion labor hours lost per year by mid-century. The estimated cost associated with that is approximately $4.7 billion by the end of the century. That's a third of the total estimated economic costs of lost labor productivity for the entire United States. This issue will be very much concentrated here, and it reflects that we have an important industrial base in agriculture, forestry, fishing, as well as hunting, mining. We've got enormous amounts of ongoing construction, and the people in the transportation, manufacturing, and utilities sector are also often outdoors and at risk to heat and need to have their heat managed to maintain occupational health safety. So there'll be a significant impact through there. Next slide. This slide shows the projected change in cooling degree days, the number of days that you need to have cooling to keep temperatures reduced to a comfortable, healthy level. It's an important issue, especially for the rural areas, because here we see the in the dark blue, these are the non-metro areas, rural areas with persistent poverty, and in the light blue are the metro areas with persistent poverty. And what we're seeing here is that the majority of non-metro areas with persistent poverty, and those are counties where there's been over 20% of the population in poverty for more than 3 decades. These are heavily concentrated in the south in areas where the additional cost for cooling is expected to increase. That to the point that it exacerbates existing stresses. The rural communities in the southeast often have limited transportation options. They have the South is seeing higher numbers of closures of hospitals in rural areas, making it potentially more difficult for people with health concerns to reach medical care on a timely basis. So the additional how do I want to say this? The ways in which this additional heat is going to influence these existing problems, the demands on incomes when there's already high levels of poverty, the demands on human health when there's already concerns about access to health care stand out here. So the concern, though, and the opportunity here is to do things like a hospital in Kentucky was doing, which is to review the ways in which you can address vulnerability to negative impacts of climate health, and think about enhancing your existing work on epidemiology, public health preparedness, and community health assessments, so that these the worst of these scenarios don't need to take place. There are lots of opportunities to increase resilience, as well as to decrease greenhouse gas emissions so that this highest scenario wouldn't occur. Next slide. So with that, and really with the message that this continues to be a key moment of choice of whether or not we'll invest significantly in those reductions of greenhouse gas emissions to avoid the worst impacts of climate change. It remains an urgent message from this. It's still possible to avoid the worst impacts, but it's more urgent and more difficult the longer that effort is delayed. So this is our full team, chapter authors, and in the next slide, our team also consulted a variety of people with specific questions and benefited from the support of the U.S. GCRP, U.S. Global Change Research Program coordinators listed here. So with that, we're happy to take questions.
Great. Thank you both
Doug,
so much.
What else?
Go ahead.
No, that's good. Perfect.
Well, thank you so much, both of you, for the great presentation and for all your work on helping put together this great report that's very helpful and handy and accessible for people who want to learn about climate change impacts on the U.S. and specifically the Southeast region. There is an executive summary that Doug recommended we send to you as a follow-up from this webinar, and that will have a lot of the high-level points on this report. So you as the attendees, you can dig into it a little bit deeper, and we'll send that follow-up email once the recording of the webinars is posted online. So with that, we'll turn to Q&A, and I have some questions that have already been submitted. If you have a question, please go ahead and on the bottom of your screen, click the Q&A box and type in your questions, and we will get to as many as we can in the time we have allotted. So first question is about the high emissions scenario. In several of the slides, Kirstin, you referenced some impacts that would happen under the higher emissions scenario. Can you explain how much warming that would be?
Sure. The way that this report addressed scenarios was to look at a more moderate and a higher end scenario. The higher one for the late 21st century, the period 2070 to 2100, would be about a 7.7 degree Fahrenheit increase. The low scenario at the end of the century would be about 4.3 degrees. But the mid scenario would also take us close to 4.4 degrees.
Okay.
The low scenario at the end of the century would also take us close to 4 degrees.
Okay. And for reference, that's the high scenario is RCP 8.5, right?
And the lower is RCP 4.5.
4.5. Okay, great. Hope that helps for who asked the question. Let's see. Okay. This one is for Kirstin. In the graphs showing days with various extremes by decade, have the 2010s bars been extrapolated to 10 years, or is it only 8 years to date in the decade? Does that ring a bell for you?
Yeah, where they show it 2010s, they did not extrapolate it. They ended early, and I think I'd have to look it up, but it would have been more likely to be 2016 be the last data, but yeah. So it's I think 2016 would be the last available data that we could incorporate in this report.
Okay. Okay.
So you should also mention that the World Meteorological Organization noted today that 2018 is on track to be the 4th warmest year on record.
Mm-hmm. Okay. That's actually a good segue to another question that we've gotten, which is it's very cold right now in much of the Southeast. How can you kind of justify the statement that the globe is warming when we get cold snaps like this?
Doug, you want that one?
Yeah, I can take that one. We get that a lot, the question quite a bit, and I would say it's the difference between weather and climate. Weather happens, now, and can happen. Most of the weather forecast models only go out 10 days. We can get these cold snaps, but most of the time we get really cold air in the Southeast is due to the jet stream dipping down lower than it normally does. And with climate change, we expect that there's going to be, as we mentioned, larger differences between the air masses. So the equator areas are going to be hotter, and then the poles potentially colder, and that's going to cause the jet stream to bend even more sometimes. So with climate change, it's really about more extremes. It's not just hotter, it's more extremes. So yes, places are going to get hotter than they normally do in the summer, but they could potentially get colder after these colder snaps in the winter. But climate is really about trends. It's not about what's happening this week or this month. It's more about long-term trends, looking at the data. And where you can get into trouble with cherry-picking data is just taking a segment of an entire data set and saying, oh, we've seen 10 years of cooling, but actually if you look at the 50-year record, that's only a little dip. And we do see dips up and down, variability. There's natural variability, and not only climate change, but sea level rise and everything else. None of these follow the smooth curves of the global climate models. but you got to look at the general trend. So what I tell people is the wet areas are going to get wetter, dry areas are going to potentially get drier, and you're going to see bigger swings in the extremes.
Great. Thank you for that perspective. Kirstin, can you explain more about the focus on high nighttime temperatures rather than high daytime temperatures?
Sure. So the human beings can handle a certain amount of high temperatures, but they also need corresponding good lengthy periods of recovery to reduce the stress on the body. So when you don't have that evening period, which is typically significantly cooler and allows the body to recover from the stresses of the day, you have a higher overall stress burden.
Okay, thanks. Here's a question specific to Florida, but I think it probably has some regional significance also. In Florida, rainfall seems to be moving to warmer months where more re-evaporates and less recharges our aquifer. Is Florida just special, or are wetter winters coming back?
I guess I can try to answer that. It's a good question. I know that a lot of the precipitation in the Southeast, especially places like Florida, they rely on a certain amount of tropical moisture. So the hurricane season, tropical storm season tends to bring a lot of the rainfall, especially extreme rainfall in the summer months, or at least the late summer, fall hurricane season months. You know, it's with, as far as and I'm not a precipitation expert, but what we may see is just changes in the distribution of the drought versus the more intense rainfall events. And that's going to be, as I said, there's going to be like natural variability. So from year to year, you're probably still going to see these sort of trends of, we may have like 5 years of drought and then go back to an area an area where it's more wet. Sort of that part is probably less predictable. A lot of the global climate models are not on that like super detailed scale, the grid modeling. So it's hard to downscale to let's say a particular city. So it's about as specific as I could get on that question.
Okay, great. Kirstin, do you want to chime in on that?
No, I think that we are seeing those changes in the seasonal differences. I think if you wanted to look into that question in more detail, the report that was just released is actually volume 2, and the volume 1 of the Global Change Research program's work is a climate change science special report, which is also available, and it spends more time on the climate changes and less on the impacts. So there's another resource we can go to.
Okay, great. Volume 1.
Volume 1.
We have a couple questions about water impacts away from the coast, inland. One question is about what types of impacts and trends are projected for inland and upland freshwater aquatic ecosystems. And another question is about water management in non-coastal areas. No more specifics about that, but just, and actually we have a third question we can lump in there. Sorry, not to pile too many on, about mudslides. So maybe Doug, do you want to talk about water impacts for inland communities on aquatic ecosystems, water management, and mudslides?
That's a broad range of things.
It really is. Sorry to confuse.
No, that's fine. Yeah, and admittedly, my expertise is more on the coastal realm. I think, in dealing with this in the chapter, there's an awful lot we could talk about in the Southeast, and part of what we wanted to address in the NCA 4 was an update or things that have changed since NCA 3. So a lot of the topics that may have been addressed in NCA3 we may not have covered as in detail. We tended to focus on the inland flooding on more low-lying areas, and admittedly we didn't cover sort of the flash flooding component and the risks involved with that. So most of the issues with mudslides and scour and things that cause problems with bridges and certainly has happened in like the 2015 flood event in South Carolina. I know in Columbia they lost dams and lost roads. That's definitely a risk. And if you look at the report that Kirstin just mentioned, the volume 1, we call it the CCSR, Climate Change Special Report, there's a section in there about extreme precipitation and what we're expecting. And I can't remember the numbers off the top of my head, but I think we're somewhere a 40% potential increase in, at least in the southeast, of more extreme precipitation events. So if there are issues already with landslides, and of course landslides and fire, we've mentioned that in our chapter 2, they kind of go together. When you have these large areas that burn, that causes more issues with mudslides and landslides. We didn't go into that specifically as a hazard. There's also a geotechnical component to that, but that's something that definitely is an issue. And I think if you look at the climate science report, you'll see that the extreme rainfalls is something that is forecasted. I'm trying to remember your other 2 questions.
Maybe I'll just say something about the impacts on water quality.
Yeah.
As an area that I think is emerging as a focus of study. There's not a great deal here, except that we do know that there are water quality impacts following drought. We know that these intense precipitation events often carry with them more sediment. And there's, of course, a well-documented concern that under higher temperatures, the water temperatures themselves will increase and not become appropriate habitat for cold water species like trout. So some of these things are starting to emerge, but the entire set of connections is not really well developed yet, to my understanding, to the best that I followed it.
Okay.
And what was the third one? What was the third question?
Water management, just general thoughts on water management.
I think I read that question. It was looking at, and I mentioned it briefly in that stormwater. There was another question specifically about stormwater too. Are they holding stormwater and treating it before it goes out into our water bodies? And I think in most cases that they don't. I mean, I don't know how many. Maybe there's a few communities that do, but I know in most communities the stormwater just goes right out. And so you'll see signs on stormwater drains saying, this flows to the river. Don't put stuff down here like paint and all that. So yeah, water quality is a big deal because the more runoff we get, if it's untreated, it's going to potentially go into our estuaries and down our rivers. As far as looking at water management inland, not at the coast, the same thing applies with stormwater management, because I think depending on the state that you're in, but there are certain state requirements for stormwater permits to basically hold or handle 25-year rain event. In some cases for things like detention ponds, it's a 10-year rain event, and you can't increase the amount of runoff from a particular property if you develop it more than what would have already been there if it wasn't developed. But in many cases, these large events we've seen over 100-year or 200 to 300-year storm events there's no way these systems can handle it. And you could make the argument that they shouldn't. They're not. It would be too expensive to design a system that could handle that much rainfall. But we are starting to see an increase. So I think it's forced us to go back and take a look at our existing stormwater management practices potentially. And as we build new areas and have new development, we can potentially plan for that and build more robust systems, or start to look at an entire watershed holistically and not just one particular subdivision, but how is that subdivision going to affect the rest of the people that are downstream? Just doing things like filling in and raising property because of to try to increase their elevation and be outside of the floodplain will displace that water somewhere else. So all these things are places things that inland areas have to worry about as well.
Mm-hmm. Okay, we have a couple questions. It sounds like from local government people, and I know that the National Climate Assessment does not make policy recommendations or anything like that. So, but you do have some excellent case studies of communities that have taken action. Doug, you were talking about all the communities that have taken action to help start addressing coastal flooding and issues like that. So we have a couple questions, it sounds like, from local government people, and we can take them together and maybe you have some perspectives. In areas where private property rights are of high importance and zoning as a four-letter word, what recommendations do you have for consultants and public planners alike to approach positive policy changes to encourage climate adaptation, for example, stormwater policy or ordinance changes? And secondarily, how do you convince decision makers to invest in adaptations, and how much money as a percentage of a municipal budget should be invested to make communities more resilient? So if you have any thoughts, maybe based on examples that you're familiar with or anything like that.
Well, this is Doug, and I think, yeah, like I said, like you mentioned, we can't really make policy type statements other than the work that I've done more locally here, especially with the city of Charleston, just advising them on things like sea level rise amounts. And they are doing, a lot of communities are starting to do vulnerability assessments. What is going to be potentially impacted and what is going to be the cost of that, and realizing that it's going to be fairly expensive, very expensive in some cases, to do adaptation actions. So then it's a matter of prioritizing what needs to be done first, and I know that requires garnering political support and whatnot to get the funding. But I think it's also caused a lot of communities to be more creative with how they do get funding from various sources. Grants, there's a lot of grants out there from federal agencies like FEMA for pre-disaster mitigation funding. There's funding from agencies like NOAA for climate resiliency. So a lot of communities are being resourceful. We're trying to pull together funds to try to start to do some of these projects and do other things like float bonds and try to use stormwater taxes and there's other options. And I think I've seen some draft like ordinances for things like flooding out there that communities can use. And a lot of it has got to do with just communities learning from other communities. For instance, the Norfolk area and the Hampton Roads area has come down and talked with the folks in Charleston about what they're doing and just sharing stories in a similar situation. And so learning from each other, mistakes, paying the price now with mistakes made in the past, how can we best go forward and solve the issues together?
And I do think there are, once people get to the point of having done the vulnerability assessment and have the opportunity to look at some of the cost-benefit associated with different choices, there's a case to be made for investing in resilience, that you often get a good return on those dollars for reducing hazard impacts.
Okay, great. Well, thank you for all of your answers. We're out of time, so we need to close out our Q&A period. Thank you to all of our attendees for asking so many great questions. We weren't able to get through them all. So we will, like I mentioned, send you a follow-up email with the recording, and feel free to reply with any specific questions that you didn't get addressed by us here. So thank you again so much, Kirstin and Doug, and thank you all to the attendees for joining today. If you enjoyed today's presentation, please consider joining SACE so we can continue to work towards clean energy solutions for the Southeast. Visit cleanenergy.org for info on how to join and become involved. Take care, everyone. Thanks.